The January 19th edition of the Kansas House Water Committee. Are there any bill introductions? Seeing none, I want the committee to be aware that the bill introduced last week is now HB 2047, and there's a copy of that in your files. I'll ask our Vice Chair to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So our first speaker this morning is the Chief Engineer, Earl Lewis. And just a little bit about him. He served 2 decades at the Kansas Water Office from 1999 to 2020. And before that, he worked for the Kansas Department of Agriculture. I would just like to add a personal note that he is available and always eager to answer questions, even the craziest questions that I had last year as my first time being on the Water Office. And I really, really appreciate him and his willingness to sit down with us. So, Chief Engineer Lewis.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having me. We'll really look forward to it, and I appreciate all of your folks' interest in water and your attention on these topics. So we're going to kind of go through a few things here. And I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, you having former Chief Engineer Barfield in, because we'll cover a little bit of the same stuff. Sometimes it's good to have some repetition. Clarify any questions you might have had after thinking about it from last week. I don't want to take too much time. I want to hit on a few things of what we do, some of the kind of hot topics that are out there, give you a couple other things that maybe I heard that from some of the questions or thoughts you had last week as you were hearing from David. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Again, my name is Earl Lewis. I'm currently the Chief Engineer of the Kansas Department of Agriculture Division of Water Resources. And we'll talk about what that means. So the Division of Water Resources goes clear back to 1927 and has been in the Department of Agriculture that entire time, administering 30 different laws and responsibilities. Primarily, the big one that gets talked about the most is the Kansas Water Appropriation Act, but certainly also dams, stream obstructions, and 4 interstate compacts. So we'll hit on each of those a little bit. So again, where do we reside? Our home office, our headquarters is in Manhattan. We're within the Department of Agriculture, and I work for the Secretary of Agriculture. The structure of Agriculture, 5 different divisions. We sit right in the middle of that. And then within our division, we have 3 different programs. We have our Water Appropriations Program, we have our Water Management Services Program, and our Water Structures Program. And I'd point out Lane Letourneau, who you'll see around the Capitol from time to time, is the Program Manager for Water Appropriations Program. That's our biggest program. Again, it covers a lot of the things we talk about with the Kansas Water Appropriation Act, so water rights, the groundwater management districts, a lot of the things that deal with the groundwater depletion and those kind of things that maybe some of you get calls about or have folks come and see you about. Lane is leading that group up for us. We also have, although we're headquartered in Manhattan, we have by law, we have field offices, and these field offices have been in place in these towns for decades. We have one here in Topeka with a satellite office down in Parsons with one person down there that helps to cover a lot of southeast Kansas. We have an office in Stafford that covers the south central part of the state. We have one in Stockton that covers the northwest part of the state, and then Garden City covering southwest Kansas. Those folks we have, about 10 to 12 folks in each of those field offices. And again, they handle a lot of the day-to-day walk-in traffic. They go out in the field, do field visits. They do a lot of work with our customers and constituents trying to make sure when they have an application that we help them out with that. If they've got an issue between water rights, we help them out with that. And so they're in the field a lot, and we try and make them available to our customers and constituents as much as possible. And really appreciate the work that our folks out in the field do. This, again, I think you probably had from David's slide last week, how we kind of break up ourselves organizationally within Division of Water Resources. Again, water appropriation, water management services, water structures. And this is the majority of the statutes that I mentioned. There's 30 that we are mentioned in or have some role in. These are the primary ones. So under the water appropriation, again, the Water Appropriation Act, the water rights piece of it, the Groundwater Management District Act and our piece there, the Water Plant Storage Act, which is primarily tied with with Kansas Water Office, and you heard from Connie Owen and Matt Enru on Tuesday. The Water Transfer Act, which I'll come back and touch on that here at the end of my talk. Assurance Program, Banking Act. So you can see each of those different pieces. There are 4 interstate compacts. Again, I'll come back and talk about those in a little bit. And then our water structures. So we think about dams, levees, if we've got floodplain fill. For the most part, each of these are about, especially when it's on the regulatory side, the reason we are regulating is primarily so that if somebody's taking the activity, we want to make sure that that activity is not having a negative impact on their neighbor, right? So if you think about a levee, if I build a levee on my side of the river, we want to make sure that it doesn't shove the river more on somebody else's side, on somebody else's property and flood them more than they would have been flooded already. We want to limit that damage and try and be fair. On the water right side, I want to make sure that if I've got a water right and I'm pumping, that I'm not pumping more than I should and taking water that somebody else has an entitlement to or impacting their well. So we're trying, in all things we're doing, to try and enforce fairness, trying to make sure that people are actively using their property in a manner that is consistent with the law, but also is fair to all their neighbors and not causing harm to their neighbors. One thing that we've been asked about the last couple of years, and again, just to kind of give you a high-level view of what that means, we've got about 75 positions, and again, about 45 of those are in lane shop and the appropriations. Our overall budget is year-to-year about $12 to $13 million. About half of that, about $5 million, not about half, about $5 to $6 million of that comes from the federal government, from FEMA. We run mapping and National Flood Insurance Program on behalf of FEMA for the state of Kansas, and so we get on the order of about $5 million a year that then we turn around and send out primarily to consulting firms to do a lot of the work that supports not only the federal piece of it, but also the counties that are involved in the National Flood Insurance Program. So that's the majority of that. We certainly have some contractual services to support our office. Most of the blue there from the State General Fund goes towards salaries and rents and operations. So that's about kind of how we break out. We get some from the State Water Plan Fund for some projects, and you kind of see the miscellaneous information there as well. We do get, the yellow portion is our fees, and so when somebody files an application, whether it's a new application, change application, dam permit, there's a fee by statute that goes along with that. If there's fines, and we'll talk about fines here in a little bit, for either people that overpump their water right or tamper with their meter or any number of things, then there's fees that come in, and those go into kind of that yellow portion that, again, primarily get used for agency operations. Okay. Can you advance that? It's not advancing for me for some reason. There we go. A lot of times we get asked, and just again, so you have this, because I know you have it in your file, how many water rights are there in the state of Kansas when we talk about that. So permanent active water rights in the state of Kansas, just over 34,000 water rights. 41 points of diversion, what does that mean? That means a well or a pump site along a stream. So there's, of the 34,000 water rights, 41,000 individual wells and pump sites in the state of Kansas. And when we say water use correspondence, that's the people that we send out a water use report to. So, those are a little over 10,500 different operators. And so that probably means primarily that's farmers, can mean cities, industries, but mainly it's farmers. So we have a little over 10,500 different folks that we interact with every single year at this time of year in water use. So in 21, what does that mean? In the state of Kansas, there was about 5.8 million acre feet that were used. Some of that was non-consumptive, so flow through at some of our power plants or Bowersock hydropower plant. We had about 3.7 million acre feet that we consider consumptive use in the state of Kansas. Most of that, again, for irrigation. 3.1 million acre feet for irrigating, again, just about 3.1 million acres of property in the state of Kansas. And again, just for context, for those of you that don't work in these numbers all the time, there's about 25 million acres of cropland in the state of Kansas that gets farmed every year. And so we're just over 10%, 12 or 13% of the total cropland acres in the state of Kansas are under irrigation on any given year. But as you can see, when we talk about 75 folks or 45 folks in the water appropriation program, but talking to 10,000 different folks each year and covering 34,000 water rights, we've got folks that are a lot of times spread pretty thin. And I know David showed you this map, and it's one we use quite a bit, so you've probably seen it a number of times, but it's in this case, the 2020 reported water use, we call it the Pac-Man chart. And again, the size of the pie, there's a pie chart for each county. The size of the pie shows the amount of water that was used in that county in 2020, and then the different colors show the different distribution. So blue being irrigation, red being municipal, yellow being industrial, and so on. And again, so this isn't rocket science here. We're talking about where's the majority of irrigation at. It's in western Kansas. That's where we have the majority of our use at. That's where we have the majority of our groundwaters at. These things kind of go together. And you can obviously see where the metropolitan areas are, whether it's Wichita or Johnson County or Topeka. You can see those in red. The majority of our yellow, most of our industrial use, is primarily for power production. So think about the cooling for a lot of our power plants, whether that's Jeffrey or Wolf Creek or Lacine. That's where you see in Pottawatomie County, the majority of the use is yellow there. Industrial, it's Jeffrey Energy Plant. And so that's where the majority of our use is at. Then, of course, we've got a number of, we see the green, the recreation, that's primarily a lot of our wildlife refuges. So if we think in central Kansas, we think about Cheyenne Bottoms, Corbera. In eastern Kansas, we've got the Meridazine or St. Paul. So that's where the majority of that green and recreational use is. We've got a number of smaller, especially in southeast Kansas, a number of individual recreation users. That's been a growing industry for us over the years. We've had a lot more duck hunters come in and have private marshes, and we've got a number of folks in that area that has been good, but can cause some issues with having a lot of high demand in a very short period of time, right? They want to all fill up their marsh in September or October, and there's a lot of them. So it gets to be a management issue. I realize we sent you the PDF. This is a much more impressive slide once we have the actual PowerPoint rather than PDF, so we'll try and make sure you get that. But it actually loops through and shows you the development of water over time and shows you when new wells went in or new points of diversion went in over time. You can kind of track that. This shows what it was in 1940, so it's not very impressive, but we'll get you the correct one here. Again, one you've seen as we think about the western part of the state, the Ogallala and the High Plains area, and we think about, okay, what does that water use mean? The key there is using water is certainly not a problem. We want folks, and in fact, the state statute says that if there's water available and somebody applies for it, Division of Water Resources, Chief Engineer has a duty to appropriate that water. The state policy is we want to put water to beneficial use. The issue we have in some areas is we didn't put any controls on that or start limiting that back before we got past the point of giving out more water rights than Mother Nature has water for us. And again, that was somewhat of a conscious decision clear back in 57 to say, we've got this huge resource, we want to use it, we want to get the economic value out of it, but now that we're kind of towards the end, what do we want to do about it? And so as we look at the water use, and we look at how the aquifer varies across western Kansas, the key question is, how much longer do we have left before things change? Whether we want them to or not, things will change. And so the map here really projects out how much longer we're going to have at least a 200 gallon a minute well in that area. And so again, I know you've seen this, and so 25, 50 years. And of course, I think one of the things that makes it difficult in some areas is, you think about southwest Kansas, and I know you heard a little about that last week. A lot of areas of southwest Kansas, you look at that yellow, that means we've got more than 100 years left. And so if you're in an area that's got a lot of water left, 100 years left, and we're talking about you need to cut back now or you need to conserve now, pretty hard sell, right? They got a lot of water left. But if you're in an area up in that Garden City to Dodge area or up in west central Kansas and in the Chairman's area, our time is not that long. And so it becomes much more immediate. And so how do we have those conversations with those different folks, and how do we create an overall plan and policy that recognizes those differences across western Kansas, but still puts us in a position to be successful? And I know that the folks from KGS are going to talk more about the data and some of those questions as well. So what do we do about that? You know, over the last decade, the legislature and our stakeholders have given us some tools, and so we've talked about the local enhanced management area, which came into place by law in 2012. And we've talked about the fact that in northwest Kansas and west central Kansas, we've got LEMAs in place or under hearing. We're going to have a hearing in, again, west central Kansas to talk about that February 2nd. Water conservation areas came into place in 2015. So a LEMA if you define an area, everybody's in, right? If you're in the LEMA boundary, you're in whether you want to be or not. You all have what we call corrective controls. And so for the most part, when we're talking about LEMA, we're talking about these issues, and a lot of what we're really talking about is reducing the overall water use in that area by some percentage. But everybody takes a little bit of a haircut. A water conservation area came into place in 2015 because there were folks in areas that didn't have LEMAs, that we're not talking about LEMAs, but folks said, I want to document my conservation, I want to have some flexibility, but I want to actually conserve water on my own property. And so we have individual farmers or groups of farmers that come together and say, I want to have a water conservation area, my groundwater management district isn't ready to move forward with the LEMA. And so we've got 53 different plans covering about 86,000 acres that are in water conservation areas today. And then when I'll come back and talk about it a little bit is multi-year flex account again came in 2012, kind of in response to the 2011-2012 drought. And it's a recognition that there's going to be times where we need to have the ability to use water over a 5-year period. So when you get a water right, you get a limit, you get an allocation that says you can use X number of acre feet in a given year. And so in a year like we just had, and I'm going to come back to this in just a second, like we just had in 22, that can be really tough. And so the multi-year flex account says if I'm in a groundwater situation, well, maybe I can borrow from a future year or save up from a previous year, go over my water right in a really tough year, but we're going to manage that water over a 5-year period rather than a single-year period. But we're going to make sure that we don't use any more water over that 5-year period than we would have if we would not have given the flexibility. And so that's a little bit of the balance here. But it's been a very successful tool, I think, since 2012. And again, for some reason, try again. It's not advancing for me again. Let's try. There we go. All right, one thing I wanted to hit on again, we can't really talk about these issues. We don't recognize where we're at here in time. And so and I pulled these off the K-State Weather Data Library website here just earlier this week. Precipitation totals for 2022. And so you can kind of see, again, on the chairman's area, I'm not sure what he got on his property, but the county total there for Lane County is 8.09 inches for the entire year. And so Finney County and Antelope Garden City, 7.96. So we've got a pretty good pocket there of around 8 inches of rainfall for the entire year. And you can see most of western Kansas in that 8 to 10 to 12 inches, again, for the entire year. Again, in eastern Kansas, the totals look pretty good. A lot of that rainfall in 2022 came really in the first half of the year. And I think as any of you that live in that part of the world know, we had some struggles as the fall came in and into the winter. We had some folks who were really struggling with getting water. Things turned dry on us in a hurry there. But what does that mean? If we think about what does that mean for normal, right? Every single county in the state of Kansas in 2022, or I should say no county in 2022 was at or above normal. Every single county was below normal in 2022. Some of them significantly. So again, going back to that, west central Kansas where we had 8 inches, they should have 20. So they got about 40% of the normal rainfall. And you can see a number of counties there, 8, 10, 12 inches short of what we would normally see. So really significant drought, right? And I didn't put up here just, if we look at 21, in the eastern part of the state, we were actually above normal for totals. In western Kansas, we were a little below, but anywhere from 2 to 5 inches below normal in 21. And so we kind of had this building drought, but this is obviously very significant when we think about how this ranks versus our history. So how does that So what does that mean? Well, we all know, again, this isn't rocket science, when we're growing crops and irrigating, when it's drier, you need more water. You need to irrigate more in order to make up that gap. When it's wetter, we need less. And so in a year like this, one of the questions we get asked is, so what if somebody pumps more than their authorized quantity? And this is something that has developed over the years, and we've worked with stakeholders to try and put in place what we call our penalty matrix. So it really looks at, and this is the overpumping portion of it. So it says if you're the first time overpumper, if you just missed it, right? If you go out like the day after, hopefully you're reading your meter pretty frequently, and you realize, like, oh, I went over today, shut it off. We're really just going to let you know that's a non-compliance. You've gone over your quantity. There's really not a penalty. Now, if you go over by 2 or 3 days, it's going to be $1,000 a day. And let's say you went over by 10 acre feet. That means next year you're going to be 20 acre feet short, right? There's going to be a water penalty as well, right? There's a financial penalty, and then there's a water penalty. And if you go over by more than 3 days, it goes from $1,000 a day and 3 times. And you can kind of work your way down. Second time you overpump, especially if you go over by a few days, you get a 1-year suspension. If you keep working your way down, we can go up to a 3 to 5 year extension or a suspension. If you are in your third, fourth offense, if you habitually overpump, ignore the rules, and you do it for a significant amount of time, then we can go up to a 5-year suspension of the water right. We've got a few of those out there. We cannot take somebody's water right away. It is a property right. Right. We have the ability under the Appropriation Act to manage those water rights, to regulate those water rights. Once a water right is developed and documented, we don't have the ability to take that water right away. Right? We can't abandon somebody's water right for them, but we can suspend them for actions they're doing on their property. And again, if we think about, you might remember those numbers of about 3 million acre feet used. In 2021, so that would be or just last year for the 21 water use season, we issued 147 overpumping orders. So we had enforcement actions on 147 people, 2,700 acre feet, and about $463,000 collected. So while overpumping is important, we want to make sure people stay in compliance. When we think about it from the standpoint of the water piece, it's not a big piece of the pie, right? If you think about 3 million acre feet used, especially for irrigation, and 2,700 acre feet was actually over their quantity. You're talking about 0.1% of the amount of water that was pumped was actually pumped illegally. Again, we want to take those seriously because we want to make sure that everybody's staying within the rules and playing fairly. But we also got to recognize that it's just a small piece of the pie when we talk about water use. So coming back to the MIFAs, again, the state law says that I can, if I'm a producer, I can apply for a multi-year flex account, a MIFA, up until December 31st and have that included in my MIFA. So in 22, we have folks applying to include the 22 year in their 5-year MIFA allocation as part of their MIFA, right? So 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. And you can see a lot of times what that means is somebody towards the end of the year, and we tried to let folks know, knowing this was a dry year, that this tool is available, rather than being in the overpumping situation. If that fits your situation, you might want to look at a MIFA. And we had 671 MIFA applications in 22. So a much bigger number than we had seen in an average year, which again, you would expect being a very dry year. That's what's going to happen. So we'll see how that plays out, but I just wanted to, again, kind of give you those numbers and where that's at. That's going to take, again, that adds to our workload of trying to make sure that we continue to process those in a timely manner and use, again, the same staff we try to with our every other water right. Interstate compacts, and I know David talked about this, again, we have 4 of them. You can see the map. I think he had the same map. I think we're in good shape with the majority of our relationships with our neighbors. We're not suing anybody now, so that's always a good start. We have regular meetings and have good working relationships with them. You know, I think the Republican and the ARC with Colorado we'll test those again this year, again, because they are in drought just like we are. And so we're going to have to watch those pretty closely. And then water quality is really a big concern on the ARC. The quality of water we get from Colorado is not good. We still use it, but it's something we are both paying attention to of how do we try and make sure that we are, that they're being a good neighbor, not only in giving us the water we're entitled to, but making sure that it's usable once it gets here. Dam safety, again, so this goes clear back to 1929. Anytime you have a dam that's over 125 acre feet, so you might think of something that's, I don't know, 15 to 20 acres in size. You might think about, if you got one of those, you might want to get a hold of our office, see whether that falls under the state regulatory size or not. There are 2,600, give or take, dams in the state of Kansas that are regulated by our staff. Again, we have 3.5 people that cover this program. 332 of those are high hazard. That means primarily there's probably a home downstream, a really highly traveled road, something like that. Another 184 that have significant, again, maybe it has a structure that's not habitable, so you might have a barn or something like that, or a low traveled road. I will say, I want to say thanks for a couple things. Last year, the legislature added funding for 3 additional positions for this program. So it gets us from 3.5 to 6.5. Unfortunately, because of the market for engineers right now, we haven't been able to hire anybody in the last 6 months in those positions, even though we've got money sitting there to do it. So that's another challenge for us. The other thing that the legislature did for us last year, I want to say thanks, is we haven't had kind of an overall review of the dam safety program and how we're doing things for decades, frankly. And so the legislature appropriated $150,000. We've hired some outside firms to take a look at how we run our program, how other states that we think maybe are successful across the nation to run their programs, how we should be running our inspection program, our permitting program. They're supposed to give us some answers back to that by about the end of June. So we won't have anything for you this session, but hopefully if there's something that's falls in your purview of statutory changes, we'll have something back for you next year to say, here's what those folks found. Again, I think it's a really good opportunity here for us. Again, I know I'm running out of time, and I apologize for going long here. A couple things that we get asked about quite a bit. We always talk about our hot topics. One is the Wichita Aquifer Storage and Recovery permits, and that's been going on for a number of years. The city of Wichita wanted to make some changes to their existing permits. We had a 3-year hearing process and ultimately denied those permit change requests, primarily based on a procedural approach to say you should have filed new applications rather than changes. And again, I'm getting way down to the weeds, probably a little wonky here for you. But the bottom line is once we did that, then the Groundwater Management District believed we should have addressed the underlying policy issues, which we did not do. And so now they've filed suit against us asking the court to rule on those policy issues. So we're awaiting a district court judge whether we're going to move forward with that case or not in Harvey County. Hayes and Russell purchased some property down in Edwards County, known as the R9 Ranch, in 1995, 1996, and here in 2015 asked to start the process to move some of that water from down by Kinsley up to Hayes and Russell, about 70 miles north. Previous Chief Engineer Barfield and DWR did the first step. It's kind of a 2-step process. So we could approve the change applications. There's a local group called the Water Protection Association of Central Kansas, or WaterPAC, that has sued us on those, has moved on us up to the Supreme Court. And parallel to that, there's also a water transfer panel that is supposed to balance anytime you move more than 2,000 acre-feet of water, more than 35 miles, there's a transfer panel that's made up of the chief engineer, the director of the Kansas Water Office, and the Secretary of Health and Environment to say whether that's in the public interest. Is it better to leave the water where it's at or to allow it to be transferred? That's kind of a different question than the water rights question itself. It's kind of a higher level. So we've initiated that transfer panel that'll probably take anywhere from 8 to 20 months to get through, probably more towards the 20 months. So probably sometime late this year or next year, we'll have some resolution on that. And then Rattlesnake Creek in Quivira continues to be an issue out there looming for us, where we've got a National Wildlife Refuge with a wetland at the bottom end of a basin, Rattlesnake Creek Basin, and we have 1,400, give or take, irrigation rights that are junior to the refuge's right. Our stream flow is being depleted. In 2015, Chief Engineer determined that their right was being impaired. They have a very senior right. And so we continue to work on how do we bring things back into balance, make sure that the refuge has the water that they're entitled to under their senior right, while not doing that in a way that protects the local economy at the same time. So that's going to continue to be a struggle for a while, I'm afraid. I think that's it. Again, I covered a lot of ground. I apologize for maybe going over my time here, but I'll be happy to try and answer questions now or whatever you feel is appropriate, Mr. Chair.
Are there any questions? Representative Blex.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Earl, for your good presentation. Of those, in 2021, 147 overpump orders issued, was there any suspensions? And when you're talking a one-year suspension, is that a total 1 year they cannot pump anything if we get to that point?
Yeah, there were some suspensions. I apologize, I don't have the number here in front of me, but yes, when we talk about a 1 year suspension, that means that water right cannot be operated for that year. And so typically, let's say somebody overpumped in 22. We get the water use report March 1st. So by the time we get all this figured out, we're probably sometime later this year, we would talk about suspending them for 24, the next opportunity.
Thank you for that clarification.
Representative Bloom.
Do you have any power to regulate? Do you have any power to regulate private ponds and dams on people's property?
Not really. When we think about a pond, we're thinking about something that's fairly small. So if we think about watershed districts, right, something that's a little more substantial, then yes, those are regulated dams, and typically we'll have to have a water right as well. So anything that has less than 15 acre-feet of water, by law, you don't have to have a water right for. If you have a pond, that's mostly the farm ponds, we don't have to have a water right, nor do they fall under the dam safety. But once you get a little bit bigger, then they fall both under the water rights and the dam safety regulations.
Even if it's on private property?
Even if it's on private property, yep.
Representative Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earl, it's good to see you. Over the years, the Division of Water Resources and the legislature have put in place a lot of conservation programs like WCAs, but they haven't always provided commensurate funding for those programs. Can you talk about some of the challenges you faced finding the staff and the resources to actually implement all of those programs?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that because, like I say, we've got 75 positions, but we've got about 10% of those that are open right now, and maybe a little bit more than that. And so, as I mentioned, with the dam safety, we've had those positions open for 6 months, and we've had a psychologist apply for one of them. Didn't hire that person. But yeah, we've got 3 open positions in Garden City right now, and we struggle to find anybody to do that. We've got an administrative position open in our Topeka field office for the last 6 months or 9 months. Can't find anybody to fill that position. So we are struggling. I think the workforce is struggling, but both from a salary perspective and flexibility, we struggle. We're not competitive in the market salary-wise. We're just not. We're as worried about losing people as we are about retaining or getting new people. We have probably lost more. In fact, one of our folks in Garden City, one of the positions we have open, somebody that worked for us for 17 years, really liked working for us, just left us to go work for the city Garden City, got a $20,000 raise for basically the same level of responsibility as what we're doing. And so we're not competitive in the market.
Representative Howerton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you mentioned a lawsuit with GMD2. Who's paying for the attorney fees in that? How does that work?
So we have in-house counsel, Department of Agriculture, that handles our side of it, unless it gets to be too big, and then we'll seek outside. GMD2 would use their revenue from their fees or taxes locally from water and land to pay for that.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. I promised the chair I'd keep it brief. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I'm also kind of interested in the water conservation programs and was wondering, when we heard from Mr. Barfield, they talked a little bit about how the Division of DWR, sorry, I'm losing my words, how they have to take due consideration of past conservation for the implementation of those programs. So I'm just kind of wondering how that works in practice. And then do you find that there, in some ways, still continues to be a use it or lose it mindset, and what contributes to that? Thank you.
I appreciate that question. I do think, what we try and look at, especially let's take the WCA, right? Water conservation areas, so we're looking at individual producer. We want to look at what their past history has been, and then what is their neighbor's history, right? How have they changed their practices? If we look at their history, have we seen a decrease in their water use? Have they put in new technology? Have they changed crops? Do we see a change in their water use history? We look at their neighborhood, and are they using less than their neighbors? And if so, we would say, yeah, we're going to try and give due consideration and think about that as we're doing the WCA. We also look at that. We think about the LEMAs, and I got to be careful here. Again, we're holding a second hearing on one of the LEMAs that's open, and I'm the hearing officer, so I don't want to prejudice or appear prejudice in my thoughts here on that. But I think we also have to look and say, okay, what is their historic use? What's the neighborhood's historic use been? And how do we make sure that we are not, the purpose is we're not penalizing somebody. That's been one of the concerns is that folks have had is like, if I use less water, when the cuts come, then I'm going to end up with less water because everybody's going to be cut by 15%. If the chairman used more water, he's going to end up with more water. And we still see that. There's that mindset. We've got folks that are pumping late into the year in November and December, trying to use up their allocation, partially because they believe that either the groundwater management district or the state is going to make a cut, and they want to make sure that when we look at their history, that they have a really robust water use history so that they're seeing less of an overall cut compared to their neighbors.
A quick follow-up, is there any way to, help prevent that mindset? Is there anything that DWR or the state can do to incentivize people to not think about it or in that way, or, is there a way to change our approach with historical use? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think there's a couple things. One, I think, we probably need to be very clear with our water using community that we are not necessarily just looking at their past water use history when we're thinking about how much water is available for use. We're talking about some kind of reduction. That we're looking at the neighborhood as well, and so I think we need to be clear with them on how we go about doing things. The other thing is, historically, we've considered waste of water to be when you get water off your authorized place of use, right? If water's running off the end of the field or spraying onto the road, legally we would say that's a waste of water. But, I think there's been a question if somebody's pumping water at Christmas time on corn stalks, there's no wheat there, is that really a beneficial use of water, right? The statute says water should be for a beneficial use. Is that a beneficial use of water, or is that a waste of water? We've historically not said that's a waste of water. And I think that's something we can have a discussion about, and again, go out and have a discussion with stakeholders and say, is that really a good use of that resource?
Thank you. We need to give a little time to our fellow presenters. I would love to have Earl, our Chief Engineer Lewis, come back and talk to us. Last summer, there was a group got together, basically the technicians between Colorado and Kansas, and viewed the irrigation methods and things in Colorado and Kansas, and sat and talked about some things. We didn't have legislators there or any of the people in agencies other than like technicians and scientists. It was awesome, the amount of cooperation that was going on there, and that's a topic that I think the committee should be aware of, working with other states on water quantity and quality, and it's something we need to pursue a little more in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next presenter, Mr. Wilson.
I'm here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. No, that's the next one. Yeah. It's your lucky day. You get two presentations from KGS staff today. So, yeah, that's the right one. Okay, again, my name is Brownie Wilson. I am with the Kansas Geological Survey. We're going to talk about groundwater today, but right at the start, I'll just kind of give you some introductory remarks about what the KGS is. We are a state agency. We work with all kinds of other agencies from the local, state to the federal level. We respond to the legislature and the governor, but we also are very much a service and research institution within the University of Kansas. And so we kind of wear two different hats. Director Calvis is here, is our relatively new director, and then Jim Butler, my colleague, the senior scientist, will give a presentation after I'm done. So basically the way the KGS works, and when we talk about making decisions, this is a decision-making body, and where we kind of fall in is that data collection, the gathering of information out in the field. We analyze that, we do various assessments, again, working with a variety of partners, and we occasionally get into the planning side on what the future might look to be like, but we don't have any regulatory authority. So we just have to answer to the numbers and then provide that information and those analyses to people and the decision makers, and then they use that information to make those decisions. And so the big part of what we do is that data gathering, the measurements that we collect, and that's very true when we talk about aquifers and how we analyze that information. So we've kind of seen a little bit of this map. This is when Earl was talking about normal precipitation. Normal is just the average over the last full 3 decades. And so this was just recently updated in 2021. But you can see the influence that we have in Kansas. We are in the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains. And so we have this gigantic or this significant gradient in our precipitation running east to west. Our western side is in a semi-arid environment. By the time you drive by, Waukene, Dodge City, you move into a subhumid, into a humid environment. And if you're going east and west, that gradient, it may increase or decrease in precipitation by as much of an inch within 20, 30 miles. And that's pretty significant. And so this has a big impact, a big influence on how water is used in Kansas. And so the Pac-Man map, everybody likes to show this one. This is just showing the average over the last 10 years. And Earl already kind of talked about that. Our population bases are in the east, irrigation is in the west, but also in southwest Kansas, a little harder to see. It's a little bit dark blue slivers in there, and that's the livestock, the confined feeding operations. Very important to the state. They tend to be confined or more located in southwest Kansas. And again, precip has a big influence on this, because if we flip that around and we got 30, 40 inches occurring in western Kansas, I guarantee you wouldn't see that level of irrigation usage. So there's a need because it's so dry, but just because you have the need, you have to have the ability to use that water. And that's where this map comes from, is like, where is that water coming from in each one of our counties? And the eastern side of the state is generally a surface water environment. People in cities and towns, almost all the uses comes from a stream, a river, or a lake, something like that. The western side of the state is typically groundwater driven, and in some cases it's exclusively supplied by groundwater supplies. Former David Barfield showed this before. This is a map we created, is showing us the major and minor aquifer units in there. Looks kind of impressive. Like, I think we have a lot of groundwater in the state. Those systems, those formations you see on the eastern side are typically not a regional aquifer system. There's more of a potential for water there, but the amount of water you can get to them is more for like domestic supplies. And so when you put the large capacity wells on there, the groundwater wells that are required by law to have a permit, this kind of tells you where water is and where it isn't in terms of its use. And so, yeah, eastern Kansas, you have a few spots, but in terms of groundwater supply on the eastern side, it's usually associated with an alluvial valley. The groundwater system is next to like the Kansas River system or the Lower Republican. But when you move into western Kansas, south central Kansas, you can see the density of those wells. And those are concentrated over primarily the High Plains Aquifer is one of the major water supplies we have in the state. And that's the supply for a lot of those black dots that you see on that map. So the High Plains Aquifer is a very large system. It covers 8 states. Runs all the way from South Dakota down into Texas. The amount of water in the entirety is on order of something that you might see in one of the smaller Great Lakes, like Lake Huron. And so people do have the impression that it's a big open space that you can actually get in there and kind of swim around and stuff, but it's not. It's full of stuff, sands and gravels, silts and clays, kind of depending on where you're located at. The western side tends to be erosional features from the Rocky Mountains. As you move into south central Kansas, that's more Eolian and wind deposited materials, but It's sediments that have been filled with water over the course of the millions of years. We kind of make a distinction with the high plains. We treat that western third as being the Ogallala portion of the high plains. And then as you move into south central Kansas, you get into the Equus beds and Great Bend Prairie. And that magic line of where that changes is the Fort Edwards County line. That's something that's kind of handy. It's kind of like trying to draw a line between like the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, right? It's all connected with water, but it's really not. They're almost like two different systems. Part of that's the climate. The Ogallala is on the semi-arid side, and you'll see this more in some of the stuff we'll be showing. So this map here again is showing us about all the water ice in Kansas, the surface and the groundwater wells. The blue ones are the surface diversions. Again, Earl talked about the watershed ponds, primarily the blue dots you see on the eastern side. And then the western side are those groundwater diversions. And again, they're kind of focused over the High Plains area. And so when we talk about some of our water issues in the High Plains, we're not talking about a resource that is continuing to grow and be accessed because of, like, say, the Front Range of Colorado, where people are just moving in droves. Their water demands are going up and up and up. Most of these wells have been in place since the 1980s. And so we're not talking about something that's growing in terms of usage. It's been there for decades. Each year, about 90% of the water in Kansas that is used is coming from a groundwater supply, and about 80 to 85% of that is used for irrigation. Again, because it's concentrated in the High Plains aquifer, this is a seasonally pumped system. There's a pumping season that occurs during the growing season because irrigation is so dominant, and then there's a non-pumping season, which we're in now, during the winter months. Did I do that? Nope? Okay. I think that's all I want to say that. Oh, yeah. And the other thing that makes Kansas a little bit unique, you can't see it on the screen, there's a picture of a well that has a little flow meter on there. It's okay. There's a little blue section of pipe on there. That's a meter that's measuring the flow that's coming out. That's part of the water use program that EWR has. What makes Kansas as unique in that is that this is part of the permitting process, and we have water use information that goes back for decades. And a lot of states in the United States and a lot of places in the world, they have no idea how much groundwater is used. They got a good handle on surface water, but groundwater supply is not so much. Kansas is different than that. We do have a good idea of how much water is used each year. We also have an active monitoring program in the state. This is the map that's showing us where wells have been measured in terms of what the depth to water is, each black dot. Again, there's not much going on on the eastern side of the state because there's just not a very large quantity of water there. It's mainly focused on the High Plains. And so those red stars on there are wells that are part of our annual program. These are when we go out in the month of January, the Kansas Geological Survey, the Division of Water Resources, and their field offices, we go out and measure about 1,400 water wells across the High Plains. And we try to do the same wells year after year. And this network gives us a regional characterization of what the aquifer looks like. And we'll look at some of the data coming from that here shortly. The other way we obtain data is through automated means. We call these index wells. Each one of those dots is a well that has been put in place solely for observation. It's not a pumping well. Much of this is through the Kansas Water Plan, the State Water Plan, and the State Water Plan Fund. The Kansas Legislature has provided us funds directly. We put some wells in on the Kansas River system, and then we also, through various grants and projects, have gotten funding to grow this program. And so what it does is we can see in real time what the water levels are doing. And so this is a hydrograph of the well just north of Scott City, going back to January 1st, 2021. You can see that seasonality of the water levels as it goes up and down in response to pumping. The water levels dropped in 2021. At the end of the season, in September, October, the wells in the area shut off. The water levels rose. And then 2022, because it has been so dry, you can just see from the water level responses, the pumping season this year has been much longer, and our water level declines have been much greater. And that's kind of, unfortunately, a theme I think we'll be seeing across the High Plains. But we can see that response in real time just looking at the water levels. Might want to move that thing out of the way again here. So we have a lot of maps at this scale. If we're looking just at the High Plains aquifer, so on the eastern side is Wichita, southwest Kansas, all the way up to northwest Kansas. This is showing us the depth of water on average over the last 3 years. And here you can kind of see a distinction between the Ogallala side. It has lots of variability. Water levels are close to the land surface, and they could be up to over 450 feet deep there in Haskell County in southwest Kansas. Compare that to south central Kansas, where 50 feet is probably a good number in terms of how close that water level is to the land surface. Because it's closer to the land surface, because it is on the more wetter side of our precipitation gradient, south central Kansas tends to recharge a little bit more, and recharge is a little bit more of a challenge on the Ogallala side. We subtract that depth of water from the land surface, and we get this map, and this is the top of the aquifer, the top of that water. And the water in the subsurface behaves the same as it does on the surface. It's going to flow to that path of least resistance, which is usually downhill. And so most of our regional flow paths in that aquifer are from west to east. But again, Kansas is flat. Our water table is even flatter. And so that water table is moving very slowly. And when we talk about movement of the water, we're talking about a foot per day or every 4 days. Kind of put that in context, 20 years ago, a mile, and that's on the very fast side. And the take-home message from that is that people do enroll in a LEMA or do a WCA, they're going to get the benefit of that water being there, that water conservation. It's just not going to slide out from underneath them and go downhill. It will be there for their use. When you subtract then from the water table elevation, what we call the bedrock, those impermeable layers are typically shales or clay layers that are holding that water up. And that's why we have that resource there. We call it the bedrock. You get this map, which is the thickness of the aquifer. So this is kind of a proxy for where do we have water and where do we don't. Where is the aquifer really thick with saturation with water, and where is it not? Again, on the Ogallala side, pretty variable. It could be 0 within 25 feet along the Oklahoma line, 3, 4, almost 500 feet along the Oklahoma line there. And again, the driver of that's that bedrock, and it's undulating. It's more like an egg crate with highs and lows as opposed to a bathtub. And so there's kind of a three-dimensional look of the bedrock in southwest Kansas, looking basically from Meade towards Hamilton County. And you can see old river valleys and paleo channels in there. This is what drives where water is and where it isn't. It's that undulations where it's high and where it's low. And so you really need, when you talk about groundwater changes, you need to look at the changes in context to where we have water and where we don't, and kind of use those together. And so this map here are showing us the water level change on the left over the last 10 years. And again, the Ogallala side is typically in a state of decline. It's just a matter of how fast. The south central Kansas goes up and down, and it has areas of local declines that are definitely an issue, but by and large, as a region, it goes up and down around the 0 line. The Ogallala side, those declines is driven by pumping. Precipitation has the influence there, not so much in the form of recharge, but precipitation influences what the pumping demands are. What the pumping demands are then kind of determines how fast that rate of decline is. And you can see that then on the map on the right is showing us the density of groundwater usage. And you can kind of see in the same areas where we have high levels of usage is also the same areas that we have high levels of decline. Now I want to come back to this PDF. Can I show that one that I gave you? And so, again, we're actively collecting data this month right here. And so I just got a bunch of data last night. We had our size from the KGS, and then the field offices from DWR, just the two of them reported in yesterday. And the Stafford one, the west, on the eastern side there, they're supposed to get to me by the end of the week. But this is the water level change this year. And again, anytime you see a darker color, that's usually bad. And so those orange areas is a 2-foot decline, and when you start seeing the darker orange, that's over a 5-foot decline. And you kind of see, again, all we have is data for the Ogallala side. Most of that area has dropped this year, and which we kind of expected. You do see the blues where areas where the well has come up. Usually what that is the last year's measurement was abnormally deep. Some of the pumping depths that we have in southwest Kansas can be substantial, and if you show up at the wrong time of year, it's definitely out of whack, and we can kind of flag those for the future. But that's kind of how it's looking right now. Honestly, it's not quite as bad as I thought, but we do have substantial areas there where we have 5, 10-foot decline in that range. And you can see that by the darker orange colors. And we'll update this map as more data comes in. I think this will be completed by the end of the week. And those water levels, you have to give me a couple hours when I get home. They'll be all online. You can actually go up there and download them. They'll be available to the public.
If I could ask a question, Brownie, kind of tying what you just said and what Earl had said earlier, like my corner of Scott County had 8.5 inches total rainfall for the year.
Yes.
If you went back to that index well just north of Scott City and looked on that, there was a rainfall event the last weekend of July where we received 3 inches of that 8.5 inch total came on those 2.5 days. If you looked at that index well, it was gradually declining through the pumping period, and there was about a 2-week time period in the middle of pumping season that was actually raising. That's because the producers in that area shut those wells down. Right. And it's a very clear indication from your graph and the information we've had before.
Yeah, you can see on this graph where you have those sharp rises and sharp declines. That's the responses to the pumping, is exactly what you're talking about. And you can see some spots in there where they did turn off for a little bit, and then the pumping season kicked back in. But yeah, you're exactly right. That's how we kind of measure these things, is just looking at the water levels. Okay, I got just a couple more slides, and then I'm done. Or are you going?
Sorry, Brownie, quick follow-up, just to give the committee kind of a baseline of how these years' levels of decline compare to previous years. Can you talk a little bit about like last year's average and what the trends you're seeing going into this year?
Well, if we going back to 96 is when the KGS started administrating the water level program in Kansas. It wasn't too bad. And then the 2000s, we started seeing a lot more declines because, especially in southwest Kansas, they fought pretty dry conditions throughout the 2000s. 2011 and 2012 were really bad across the entire state. And that's where we saw some pretty significant groundwater declines. And then things got better. 2017, 18, 19, there was at or above normal precipitations, and the water levels in some areas look pretty good. And we're starting to take a step back now more to those conditions that we saw in 2012 and 11. Actually, I think the precipitation patterns we got this year were less than what they got in 11 and 12. So, but we'll put out a graph that will show exactly that long-term regional change in the water table, and you can just see, oh, that was a wet year, that was a dry year, for sure. Okay, a couple more slides. I want to talk about this map that gets a lot of action. We call this the estimated usable lifetime map. And the challenges we have with talking about what the future is going to hold is kind of like having a magic 8 ball. And every time you ask the question, it's like, will my water supply last 20 years? Maybe. It'll always give you the same answer. It'll be non-committal, right? Maybe. We don't know because there's lots of variables that go in there. But the estimated usable lifetime map, all this is said, okay, I showed you a map that had a thickness. The aquifer is this thick in this location. Over the last 10 years, if the water levels drop like this every year, how long until this thickness gets to a point where we can't do 200 gallons a minute from a single well? So we're not talking about going bone dry. You can do it, it has happened, but you really have to make an effort to make an aquifer go completely dry. That's more driven by the bedrock. Usually what happens is people's well yields start to fall off and they make changes. So the brown areas are basically saying you're there today. You can't pump 200 gallons a minute all year. But there's people that are still operating there. They're still irrigating. The lighter areas, the reds are 25 years and 50. Again, it just depends how thick it is and what the water level changes are going to be. So some of the heartburn we have in showing this map is people are using this to make real-time decisions. And there's lots of uncertainties here. And when we look at some of the water levels again from our index wells, we look at the one that we have in the very northeast corner of Haskell County, we see that this well drops sometimes 100 feet during the pumping season. And then it comes back up 97 when the wells turn off. But the thickness map is assuming the water levels are at the very top of that graph. When they're at the very bottom of the graph, it's not 160 feet of thickness, it's more like 40. And so that changes the answer you're going to get on this map quite drastically, because if that 40 feet of thickness starts bouncing off the bottoms, the well yields are really going to start dropping off. Plus, we have other systems like in southwest Kansas. We have the Dakota aquifer system that comes into play here. So this is a great map for discussion purposes, but we got a little gun shy because people were making actual real-time decisions with it, and so you got to put it in the context for what it is. A better tool that we have are groundwater models, and models are trying to replicate the hydrologic cycle of especially the groundwater systems. These are the areas that we've been involved with. That missing area in GMD5, they have their own model, which is just fine. It's great. These are great tools. They're big and expensive and take a long time to make. But then you can do like what if type questions. Well, what if it rained? What if it didn't rain? What if we cut pumping? what will the water levels do and change in response to those changes in the budget. So we do that in Wichita County. If we had a WCA come in, what can we expect? Southwest Kansas, we did a model we're updating now back in 2008. We kind of shot out in the future. How much water in 50 years do we think is going to be there? And what do we think the flow rates are going to be like? So the groundwater tools are probably a better thing to have in the toolbox to answer what the lifetime will be like. And so my last slide, though, again, it really, when we talk about how long the usable lifetime of the aquifer, there's lots of stuff that goes into play here. The physical properties of the aquifer itself is probably the big one, because some areas it's thick, some areas it's shallow, some area, all the good stuff, the sands and gravel are at the bottom. Some places, the sands and gravels, the water levels have passed through it, and they're starting to move into more marginal material that's not quite as productive. Economic drivers. When we see $8 corn hit the market, we see a lot of wells come back into production that maybe weren't there before, because it makes economic sense to turn them on. And then in the end of the day, though, it really comes down to that individual landowner, that water right holder, what's their decision on if they want to operate or not. And so this is a picture that was taken last year in an area that was brown on the map. We said their estimated usable lifetime was over, it's now, and this well was pumping 12 gallons a minute, which is about what you can do with a garden hose. A good garden hose, right? You can squirt your brother or sister across the street with it. But it's not very much water. But this well was operating, had a diesel pump on it, was spending all kinds of fuel costs, and he was just irrigating 5 rows on a flood system and wasn't quite making it. His mind, he still has usable lifetime left. Our minds, well, maybe not. And so that's what kind of gets hard to say, when is the end of the lifetime of an aquifer really going to happen? What you'll see is people change their behaviors, or they change their irrigation practices. Instead of irrigating large fields, they irrigate smaller fields, or they change their cropping varieties, or they just bring it down in scale. That's my last slide, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if you want me to stand for questions or have my colleague come in and
I
ask
think we have a question from Representative Blex.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. Do you have any, or done any research on index wells that may be in an area of concentrated playas to see if the water level in them is moving less or more, or, and I know we haven't had any rain, which playa isn't very effective.
Yeah, it doesn't help. And so the playa question is one that's been getting a lot of play lately, and a lot of people have been asking about that. So the playas are those shallow depressions that are formed naturally across the high plains, and they tend to fill with water. And so the question is, do they enhance the recharge into the aquifer system? And recharge is one of those budget components that everybody likes to talk about, and it's really hard to measure because there's lots of factors. What's the crop type, or what's the land cover that allows that water to get into the subsurface? Is it a parking lot? Is it a crops? Is it a barren field? You have to get that water into the ground initially. Is that water column wet? Is it dry? But regardless of, once that water gets into the aquifer, it's going to travel down, but it's only going to go as fast as the least permeable layer that's in the subsurface. It's not all sands and gravels. There's going to be clay layers in there. And so it's all going to get backed up. It's kind of like driving down a 2-lane highway. You're going 65 and you hit a semi going 50, and they got everybody backed up. That's as fast as that water is going to go. That's the fastest that layer will let it go. And so that's the question then with the playas. Do they allow that enhanced recharge to take place? I think they will allow the water to get into the subsurface, and then it'll be up to the same rules and regulations that the aquifer itself governs. And the last point I was going to make, there are lots of research efforts that we're part of where we're drilling cores, and we might try to estimate what that recharge rates are, and maybe we can apply that into our groundwater models to see what kind of effect they might have. So short answer, it's an area of ongoing research.
Thank you for that.
No other questions, I'll ask one. Well hydrology. When someone drills a well, it's like putting a straw down into that aquifer. And that well is productive based on many factors. As the water flows to that, basically you're pulling water from the bottom of the well to the surface. If you have very permeous or porous material, that funnel shape is very wide at the top and tapers down. If you have those clay layers, you might have a couple of funnels, I'm guessing. So as we lose on the water table, say we lose half of it, you've actually lost more than half of the potential production of that well. Am I correct?
Yeah, again, it kind of depends on what that material is. And so the basic idea is when the well turns on, the water table right around that well will just drop, and it forms a funnel. It's just like a bathtub when you drain the water out and you see the little tornado going down the drain, but it's coming right back up again. That's the same concept here. How big is that cone is determined by what that material is. And so if it's really coarse sands and gravels, the drawdown won't be as much because the water can flow readily to the well. When it becomes more tighter, less permeable, that starts to spread out and get deeper. And so that's, again, that's the pumping depth. That's a great point, is if that pumping depth starts bouncing off the bottom, that's when the flow rates really start to drop off, because the aquifer itself now is saying, I can't supply enough water given that flow capacity. And that's when they start pulling air and stuff like that up with the water.
Representative Howerton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just clarification on that thought, no well is the same.
Right. Yeah, good or bad, that's kind of the nice thing about my job is somebody asks me questions, I can always say, well, it depends, right? It depends where you're located at, and that's exactly true. No true well is the same. Now, regionally, again, the aquifer is not homogeneous. It's not all sands and gravels. Everywhere, it's there's lots of variety that's in there. And so that's one of the big questions we have in the future. Can we better do a CAT scan, if you will, of the aquifer properties themselves? We have abilities to do that now with our well logs, but we can do even a better job with that. But of course, those kind of things cost money and time.
Representative Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To piggyback on those two questions, so when we look at our water rights system where we have strict priority, and you've just very nicely summarized the complexities of groundwater as these levels diminish, can you just talk about the difficulty in determining well-to-well impairment and how that, not the legal explanation, but it can be hard to tell impacts and administrate by seniority, if that's a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, it's much more of a neighborhood influence as opposed to, like, pumping in Garden City is not influencing what's going on in Scott. It's just, that's too big of, even though it's only 30 miles away, that's too big of an area. It's much more of a neighborhood type question. And again, it goes to those flow rates, it goes to the heterogeneity of the aquifer itself. It's much more of a localized question. But what we see now, and with these maps with our water level program, is much more of a regional decline in the water level. That's very true, but there can be some variations even within that we don't see. And we kind of pick that up with the more index wells we have, the better we can answer those questions on a localized level.
Representative Sywert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to kind of follow up on a question you kind of asked, the cone of depression on wells, why does the Department of Water Resources, whoever permits them, why do they let them put them a foot from the neighbor's property line? Because now you're sucking the water out from the neighbor.
That's an Earl question for sure.
Well, you was talking about that flow down, and again.
Well, there are rules in place in terms of well spacing, and the well spacing goes just to that. They don't want well-to-well interference, but again, this is a real question, but regional lowering of the water table is not viewed as impairment. It has to be an economic hit on that well, and so it's your property. You can put that well wherever you want, but you're still subject to spacing, and the spacing changes depending on where you're at. There's different rules for different places,
But kind of in that line is, you talk about your property rights, what about the person's property rights beside you? Because there usually should be a setback, because when we talk about now, he doesn't have any water, and surface water, like you said, it draws down. I just was kind of curious why they allowed that, because an oil well cannot be on the property line.
You want some of this, or? Well, I mean, one of the reasons, too, they have rules in place that you can only go out so far on a change application, because they don't want people necessarily chasing water. The good water's over here, so I'm going to keep moving that direction. Or I'm just going to drill a well and immediately apply for a change, even though I never developed it. And so I think the issues you have are recognized. They're trying to avoid people chasing water, and they're trying to avoid direct well-to-well impairment. Okay? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, we better move along. Mr. Butler, would you present? Representative, you're sure welcome to talk to the people here after the meeting about that issue, I'm sure. Mr. Butler?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I'm Jim Butler with the Kansas Geological Survey. As my colleague Brownie Wilson indicated, KGS is a research and service division of the University of Kansas. We have no regulatory or policy-making function. Our mission, when you cut to the chase, is to provide a sound scientific foundation for decision-making on natural resources issues within the state of Kansas. And clearly, one of our most important natural resources issues is the groundwater in our aquifers, and specifically the groundwater in the High Plains Aquifer. So that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. Now, as Brownie indicated, the High Plains Aquifer is not unique to Kansas. It extends over portions of 8 states here in the central U.S. Now, Kansas, like many of our neighboring states, has heavily pumped this aquifer for decades in support of irrigated agriculture. That intensive use has come at a price in terms of aquifer conditions. And I will illustrate the price with this figure here. This is a map of percent change in aquifer thickness since pre-development, since the onset of widespread pumping for irrigated agriculture. Think 40s through late 50s here in Kansas. The blues in this map, areas of aquifer increase. Everything else, aquifer decrease. Deepest reds, over 60% of the aquifer is gone. And I should note, in the western 40 to 50% of this map, the blue areas there were thin aquifer from the get-go, not of practical importance. Now let's focus in on what Brownie called the Ogallala portion of the aquifer. This is the aquifer in western Kansas. It's clear this area, there are areas in this portion of the aquifer that are facing serious challenges. Now, as Brownie and others have shown, continuation of business as usual, extending the rate of decline into the future, is not going to end well. So, what can we do to moderate the rate of decline? And I'm going to talk about that today. Now, I guess most of you know about this idea, this proposal, take water from the Missouri, ship it out west via aqueduct, recharge the aquifer. KGS does not take any position on such projects. And I think all of us, regardless of our view of the merits of that proposal, can agree on one key point. It's not happening anytime soon. And I think I define soon as several decades or more. So what are we going to do in the meantime? Well, we have got one option, and that is to reduce pumping in conjunction with modification of agricultural practices. So how much do we need to reduce pumping to have a significant impact on these water level decline rates? Well, that's a difficult question to get at, and that's something that we at the Kansas Geological Survey have been working on for some time. Over the last few years, we've developed a theoretical framework for answering that question of just how much pumping reductions will impact decline rates. And the reason we've developed this is because we have 2 long-running programs that have provided us with the data that enabled us to develop this theoretically sound approach. And I just want to talk about those long-running programs. Brownie mentioned them both. This is the index well program. Each one of these green plus signs is a well with a continuous water level measuring sensor. Every hour we take a measurement of the water level position, sends out via telemetry to the KGS website where it's visible, it's viewable by anyone in near real time. Now, we started this program back in 2007 with 3 wells. The value of the information we got from those wells led us to increase the program. We're now operating at 32 sites in all 5 GMDs, 25 of which are on telemetry. And I just want to show you the record from one of the original 3 wells. This is up in Thomas County. This is a Thomas County index well. And this is the what we call the hydrograph. On the y-axis, that's elevation of water level. On the x, that's time. The black line is the record from that water level sensor every hour since 2007, summer 2007. The diamonds and circles are manual measurements we do to make sure that the sensor is operating correctly. Now, you might move up the picture of the video, or you might even shrink it. It's not really playing to my strengths. Notice that at the end here in 2022, that'd be perfect, yeah. Yeah, whatever. I'll leave it up to you. That is not good. Yeah, that is not good. No, yeah. Thank you. Notice in 2022, and this is a point Brownie made as well, notice the decline of the water level in the 2022 irrigation season. That is the largest decline that we have observed in this record. And again, it's a demonstration of the severity of conditions we faced in the 2022 and are still facing today in much of the state. Now, I'm not going to go into details here, but it's this very hydrograph that enabled us to glean insights into approaches to estimate how much the water level decline would be impacted by pumping reductions. We were able to take this theoretical framework and then apply it to another long-running program that we have at the KGS, and that is the annual water level measurement program. So as Brownie said, every year we and DWR send out teams, measure water levels in a network of approximately 1,400 wells across the High Plains Aquifer. We've been doing that for decades. We're able to take that data plus the water level metering data we have, which frankly is the best, not just in the United States, but in the world. We are able to take that data and be able to estimate at virtually any point in the aquifer how much pumping needs to be reduced if folks aspire to achieve a certain reduction in the water level decline rate. So I just wanted to let you know that tool has been developed. It's being used for folks planning LEMAs and WCAs. So I just wanted to inform the committee that exists. Okay, let's talk about LEMAs real quickly here. 3 of them in existence. Sheridan 6, Groundwater Management, District 4, Wichita County. Now, we get asked at this survey, how are these LEMAs doing? So I just wanted to talk very briefly about that, and I'm going to focus on the question of, is water use actually being reduced in these LEMAs? And at the survey, we've developed a very simple approach to assess that, and I'll demonstrate it here. Okay, the simple plot, y-axis, that's annual water use, annual pumping. On the x, that's precipitation. The blue points are pre-LEMA. The plus signs are LEMA data. Each one of those points is the annual pumping and precipitation for that year. I've fit straight lines here just to make the difference a little clearer. The goal here of the folks in the Sheridan 6 LEMA was to reduce water use by 20%. Now, we're able to use this approach and correct for climatic conditions because you can see the LEMA period was wetter than the pre-LEMA period, so we can correct for that. They have achieved a reduction of 30% approximately. That is an impressive achievement, and I think it speaks volumes for the resourcefulness and the commitment of the producers in the Sheridan 6 area. So I think it's a very impressive achievement there. So Sheridan 6, they're doing very well. Let's move to Groundwater Management District 4's LEMA, established in 2018. The same sort of thing, water use, precipitation. Water use on the Y, precipitation on the X. The circles here are pre-LEMA. Stars are LEMA data. The 2018 point is artificially low because in 2018, GMD4 suffered through some serious hailstorms that decreased the pumping that year. Bottom line here for GMD4, we cannot pick up any indication of significant reductions in water use in this LEMA. And they have rather modest goals, and hopefully down the line, the goals they'll aspire to reduce water use a bit more. But at this point, we cannot see any indication of water use, any indication of significant reductions in water use. Wichita County, this LEMA started in 2021, but it was preceded by WCA's 2017, and it really got rolling in 2018. Again, same deal. The circles here, pre-LEMA, WCA, the diamonds are the WCAs and the LEMA. Again, just as in Sheridan 6, the producers in Wichita County have done an impressive job, and they have been able to improve the efficiency of water use by 26%. Again, this speaks to the resourcefulness, the commitment for these producers to step up to the challenge and be able to make it work. So 2 of the 3 LEMAs seem to have done an excellent job in terms of reducing water use. I just want to return here to Sheridan 6, talk about another related topic, and that is the 3 critically important elements of a successful LEMA. First, they've got to reduce the water use, as shown here in Sheridan 6. Now, why are they reducing the water use? They're reducing the water use because they want to reduce the decline rate in the aquifer. So the second important element is the decline rate needs to be reduced. So we'll look at that for Sheridan 6. This is a different plotting format. This is average annual water level change on the Y. This is annual water use pumping on the X. The circles, pre-LEMA data, the plus signs are the LEMA data. And again, what we see is a significant decrease through the LEMA activities. The producers have diminished the average rate of decline in the aquifer significantly. And we can estimate, controlling for climatic conditions, they've been able to reduce the rate of decline by 58%, which is a very impressive achievement. They're still losing about 5 inches of aquifer per year. They would need to reduce about another 13% to get rid of that. But this is a great achievement. They're extending the lifespan of the aquifer significantly as a result. Now note, these points all fall on this basically a linear format here. Now, that's an indication that the net inflow to the area is not changing with time, and it hasn't changed in the last 20 years. But we have changed conditions in the aquifer because we've reduced pumping. Eventually, those changes will lead to changes in the net inflow into the area, and that will result in, for the same pumping, that they'll get more water level declines. And we'll be able to detect that through our monitoring, and we'll be able to work with GMD4 and the producers there and say, if you all want to continue to maintain that 5 inches a year average, you're going to need to reduce pumping more. When will that occur? We don't know yet. Monitoring will help us out. We're hoping for another 1 to 2 decades, but we'll have to see. The data will ultimately tell the story. So that's the second critical element for a successful LEMA. The third, obviously, is economic viability. Now, I am not an economist and don't aspire to be one, but based on the reports of the producers and the ag economists at K-State, it appears that the producers in Sheridan 6 have been able to reduce the water use, reduce the water level decline rate, and do it without affecting their bottom line. So I think it's been that, you could say that's a very successful effort. Okay, very quickly, I don't want to go over time here. Let's return to this map of percent change in aquifer thickness. And let's change topics a bit and look at water quality. I focused on water quantity, and the water quality in the Ogallala Aquifer is generally good. There is an area of concern I wanted to bring to the attention of the committee, and that is the area circled there just west of Garden City. Notice the light color there indicating there's been very little decrease in aquifer thickness since pre-development, since the onset of widespread pumping for irrigated agriculture. The reason is we're getting recharge from the Ark River coming in from Colorado is recharging the aquifer there. And so we're not, we're able to maintain the aquifer thickness. So in terms of groundwater quantity, that's very good. The problem is, as I believe Earl mentioned, the quality of that water is not good. We've got problems with high concentrations of sulfate and, most importantly, uranium. These are naturally derived substances. They're concentrated. They're from the shales in eastern Colorado. They're concentrated due to irrigation activities in Colorado and just sitting in those shallow reservoirs there. When the water hits the state line, the average concentration is twice the EPA maximum concentration for uranium. And so that water flows into Kansas. And where does it go? It goes into the High Plains Aquifer. And so this is a topic that we've studied at the KGS with support from the Water Office, help from KDHE and GMD3. We've just finished up a report that's going through the final stage of review that will release within the next month, talking about the challenges faced in this area. And I've just got one map from that report. This is of uranium concentration in the groundwater, in the High Plains Aquifer. The maximum contaminant level set by the EPA is 30 micrograms per liter. So the yellow, what is that, browns and reds are all above that. And we have seen irrigation wells where the concentrations are 3 or 4 times the EPA standard. So this is an issue that could prove to be a real problem for agriculture west of Garden City. And my colleague, Don Whittemore, along with Jonathan Aguilar at the KSU Ag Station there at Garden City, they did a study of uptake of uranium in plants. And what they found, it's concentrating in the roots. So, look at the past of Garden City. This would not be a good time to return to sugar beets. But also, it's concentrating in the stalks and the leaves. And that has ramifications, obviously, for alfalfa. So this is an area we need to pay attention to, keep abreast of, further work to understand how that's playing out. This is not going to disperse. It is just going to continue to build over time. So I wanted to bring this to y'all's attention. We'll have a report, as I said, out within a month on this. And with that, I'm going to try to bring this to a close, return to this map again. And as I tried to concentrate here on the Ogallala portion of the aquifer, but I do want to say something about the south central portion. As you can see from this map, they're in relatively good shape. But Ogallala portion of the aquifer, there are areas facing significant challenges. I get asked a lot by folks, they ask me, what's the status of the High Plains Aquifer in western Kansas? And I typically say something along the lines of, the hour is late, but all is not lost, because there are things we can do to considerably extend the lifespan of this aquifer. The producers in Sheridan 6 and Wichita County are showing us the way forward. We at KGS have developed these tools that can be used by folks anywhere in the aquifer to decide how they want to move forward. So with that, one other point, and then I'll stand for questions. The KGS has these public information circulars that we put out back in 2001. We put one out on the High Plains Aquifer. We periodically update these. We just finished an update earlier this month. It's going to the printer. We should have copies in a month, well, in less than a month, and I will provide those to the committee. And with that, I will bring it to a close. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Any questions? Representative Stockstill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very interesting presentation. And I was just curious on the uranium issue. Do you think that will be contained in the area that was shown, or does that have the potential of traveling on through Kansas?
I think it's largely going to be in the area shown. Groundwater moves so slowly, and the Ark River, which is the source of it, never makes it past Garden City. So I don't think that's a problem. It's not going to be moving down to Dodge City or something like that anytime.
Thank you.
Representative White.
I know we're out of time, but just quickly, there was a lawsuit, Kansas and Colorado. There was no language of water quality in that lawsuit, give us more water. Was it short-sighted by your opinion?
I'm not going to give an opinion on that because I don't have enough knowledge. However, the individual to my left is very well qualified to do so.
Throw him under the bus, will you?
I have no problems doing that.
Real quickly, just to follow up on that, the language, there is language in the compact that says that the state of Colorado cannot materially deplete the usable state line flow. And so there's not been a clear definition of what a usable state line flow has meant. Historically, that's meant you've got to provide a certain amount of water that can be used primarily for irrigation. But I think one of the questions we have, especially from a research standpoint, is at what point are they delivering water that we can no longer use? And then what's our recourse? And is there a legal recourse or some other action? And that's why we're trying to have this, interstate, cooperation to try and avoid that litigation.
Okay, thank you, Earl, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the uranium map, did that overlay match, so there's surface water irrigation and canal systems through there. Did that overlay match where those canal systems exist, or is that just flow out of the channel?
No, I'm trying to bring this up. Let's see if I can. The canal system is helping to distribute that water all over the doggone place, yes.
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Butler. You briefly mentioned the Q-stable numbers, or the numbers at which, pumping would need to be at in order to stabilize the aquifer. Do you have like a range or what those numbers would be by GMD?
We have done that calculation. I don't have them on the top of my head, but I certainly can provide them.
Okay, I just ask, the last time I think I heard those numbers, it was within the range that Sheridan 6 and Wichita have already started to conserve in their management plans, and I just found that really hopeful that, the areas that are taking this meaningful action to implement and reduce their use while maintaining cash flow are able to do that and reach those levels that are needed to stabilize, so.
Yeah, in general, that's true. The large regional averages are that, but if you go down into particular areas, there's going to be larger reductions required.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
We need to wrap this up. Committee next week, we have a very busy week again. Don Buehler with the Kansas Water Authority will present on Tuesday, and on Thursday we'll have representatives from GMD 1 and 4 here, so you can start working on your questions for them or our chief water engineer, whoever's available. Dawn's in the back of the room. She can wave her hand. If you have any preliminary questions, you can ask her today. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.